Welcome to EJC News Focus. When a former journal editor suggested in a blog that cancer is the best way to die, he caused an instant media storm. But then what? I met Charlotte Brinton, a researcher at University College London, and asked her what happened next.
So this piece of work started about a year ago when former editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal, the BMJ, Dr. Richard Smith, wrote in a BMJ blog post that he thought that cancer was the best way to die. Now this caused a lot of criticism in both comments that were left on his blog but also in the national media. A lot of people felt that this didn't do justice to the daily experience of those people living with terminal cancer, and that his view was a romantic view of dying from cancer, and that it was misguided and highly insensitive to cancer patients and their families. We also know that from previous research that a lot of people are afraid of cancer and are afraid of dying from cancer. And cancer is often seen as a particularly bad death. So people tend to see cancer as a death that drags on, a death that is particularly painful and that causes a lot of suffering. So in this piece of research, we wanted to see if cancer can also actually have a couple of characteristics of what is called a good death.
Could you outline the survey you carried out?
Yes. So from the end-of-life literature, we already know what are the characteristics of a good death. But these studies have all been done in patients with a terminal illness or in their family members and caregivers or even in hospice staff. So we don't know if these characteristics of a good death also apply to the general population. So what we did in our survey is first we selected 5 of these characteristics that are commonly seen as being characteristics of a good death. And these 5 characteristics are having control over what happens when you die, such as who is present or whether you die at home or in hospital, having control over pain and other symptoms, having the time to settle affairs, having time to say goodbye to loved ones, and also being able to live independently and with dignity until you die. So we selected these 5 characteristics and we asked a sample of people in the general population who were between the ages of 50 and 70, whether they consider these characteristics as being important for their own death. Then we asked them to imagine someone who was dying from cancer, and we asked them how likely these people would be, in their opinion, to experience all of these 5 characteristics. But these characteristics these ratings do not mean a lot by themselves, so we also decided to compare them with dying from another disease. And we chose heart disease, and the reason for that is that both cancer and heart disease account for nearly 1/3 of all deaths every year in the UK. But the public perceptions about what these deaths are like could not be more different. So, for example, a cancer death is often seen as a death that drags on, a death that is really painful, and a death that causes a lot of suffering to the patient. Whereas a heart disease death is often thought as being quick and neat and relatively painless. So these are very different. So we also asked people to imagine someone dying from heart disease, and then we asked them to rate the likelihood of each of these 5 characteristics, just like we did for cancer. Finally, we asked people if they agreed with Richard Smith that cancer was the best way to die. So we quoted the piece in his blog in which he made his statement for why he thinks cancer is the best way to die. And we asked people if they agreed with his statement, yes or no.
What did you find?
So interestingly, we found that 40% of people agreed with Richard Smith that cancer was the best way to die, which seems like a surprisingly high number given all of the negative comments that he got when he first posted the blog. But when we looked at the individual characteristics, we actually saw that people rated a cancer death as being slightly more positive than a death from heart disease, and again, that's quite surprising.
What are the implications of the research? Why does it matter how we perceive death?
So recent estimates suggest that 1 in 2 of us are likely to be diagnosed with cancer during our lifetime. So it's quite encouraging to see that so many people think that cancer can be a good death, because so many of us will be diagnosed with cancer, will be living with cancer or even dying from it. We also know from previous research that a lot of people are afraid of cancer and are afraid of dying from cancer. And obviously fear in itself is a very unpleasant emotion, but it may also cost people their life if it puts them off from going for screening, for example, or going to see their doctor with a symptom. So it's important that we get the message out there that cancer doesn't need to be the dread that it used to be, and that cancer outcomes are continuously improving. And studies such as this, where we look at the public perceptions about cancer in the general population, might help us do that.
How important is it that we have discussions about the end of life?
I think it's really important that those conversations are held by people. we know that we don't always have much influence over what we die from, but we do have some influence over how we die. And we know from previous research again that 80% of people, or more than 80% of people, feel uncomfortable having these discussions, at least in the UK. And this also means that those preferences aren't always implemented. So for example, between 70 and 80% of people prefer to die at home, but we know that in England 50% of deaths occur in hospitals. So if we don't have these conversations, it's going to be really difficult to take these preferences into account, and we do need to have these conversations to make sure that everyone is able to die the death that they would want to die.
So Richard Smith's comments may have started a conversation that could help us all. And with thanks to Charlotte Frinton, that's it for this month's EJC News Focus.